Chapter 6. One of the first things Kristin had marked at her old home was that all the old heads of men that had stood where the verge boards crossed at the house gables were gone now. Instead there had been set up spires with carven birds and foliage work, and the new storehouse had a gilded weather vane. The old posts of the high seat in the hearth-room house, too, had been changed for new. The old ones had been carved in the likeness of two men. Ugly enough, but it was thought that they had been there ever since the house was built, and the custom had been to smear them with fat and bathe them with ale at festivals. On the new posts her father had carved out two men with helms and shields marked with the cross. "'Twas not St. Olaf himself," said he, "for it seemed to him unmeet that a sinful man should have images of the holy ones in his house, except to pray before them. But they might, he thought, be two warriors of Olaf's guard." All the old carvings Lavrans had himself cut up and burnt. The serving men dared not touch them. It was with some doubt he still let them bear out food to the great stone at Jorun's grave mound on holy eves. But yet he thought 'twas sin and shame to deny to the tenant of the mound what he had been used to be given ever since folk had dwelt upon the place. He had died long before Christendom had come to Norway, so it was not his fault that he was a heathen. Folks around didn't like these new-fangled doings of Lavrans. 'Twas well enough for him, who could afford to buy himself protection in other quarters. What he got seemed, indeed, to have all the virtue needed, for he had the same good fortune in husbandry as before. But there were those who asked whether yonder folk would not avenge themselves when they came a master to the manor who was less pious and not so open-handed towards the church and all her belongings. And for small folk was cheaper to give the old ones what they were used to have, rather than make foes of them and trust wholly to the priests. Besides, it was none too sure, folk thought, how it would go with the friendship between Jorungard and the parsonage when Sigrid Undset should pass away. The priest was grown old and weakly now, so that he had need of a chaplain to help him. He had first spoken to the bishop of his daughter's son, Benteen Johnson. But Lavrans too spoke to the bishop. He was a friend of his of old. Folks thought this misjudged. True, it might well be that the young priest had been too forward with Kristin Lavransdatter that evening, and maybe frighted the girl. But none could know that she might not herself have given some cause for the fellow's boldness. It had come out plainly enough since that she was none so coy as she had seemed. But the truth was, Lavrans had ever put too much faith in that daughter of his, adoring her almost as if she were a sacred thing. Afterwards there had been coldness for a time between Sigrid Undset and Lavrans, but then came this Sigrid Solmund as chaplain, and he straightway fell at loggerheads with his parish priest over some lands, whether they belonged to the glebe or were Sigrid Undset's own. Lavrans knew more than all other men in the parish of all sales of land and the like from the earliest days, and it was on his witness that the case was adjudged. Since then he and Sigrid Solmund had not been friends. But Sigrid Undset and Audun, the old deacon, now lived at Jorungard, one might say, for they went thither daily and sat with Lavrans, bemoaned the wrongs and vexations they had to suffer at the hands of the new priest, and were waited on as though they had been two bishops. Kristin had already heard somewhat of all this from Borgard Tronsson of Sundbu. He had wedded a wife from the Trondheim country, and had been a guest at Huseby more than once. Trond Giesling was dead some years before. None deemed him much loss, for he had been a cankered shoot of the old tree, churlish, cross-grained and sickly. Lavrans was the only one who had put up with Trond. He pitied his brother-in-law, and yet more Gudrid his wife. Now they were gone. All their 4 sons lived together on the manor. They were comely, bold, and likely men, so folk deemed it a good exchange. There was close friendship between them and their uncle at Jorengard. He rode over to Sundby a couple of times each year, and went a hunting with them in the West Hills. But Borgar had told Kristin 'twas beyond all reason that Lavrans and Ranfrid tormented themselves now with penances and godliness. "He swills down water as hard as ever on fast days. But he communes not with the ale-cup, your father, with the good old heartiness that he used to," said Borgar. None could understand the man. 'Twas not to be believed that Lavrans had any secret sin to atone for. So far as folks knew, he must sure have lived as Christianly as any son of Adam, saving the holy saints. Deep down in Kristin's heart there stirred a dim surmise why her father strove thus to come near and ever nearer to his God. But she dared not think it out clearly. She would not own to herself that she saw how changed her father was. 'Twas not that he was so greatly aged. He had kept his shapely form and his upright and gracious bearing. He was greying fast, but folk marked it not much, because his hair had always been so light in colour. And yet her remembrance was ever haunted by the picture of the young, fair-shining man, the fresh rounding of the cheeks in the long, narrow face, the clear red of the skin under the sunburn, the red full mouth with deep-cut corners. Now was the well-rounded muscular body shrunk into nothing but bone and sinew, the face brown and sharp as though carven in wood. The cheeks were flat and lean, the mouth had a knot of muscle at each corner. But then he was no young man any more, though neither, after all, was he so old. Quiet, sedate and thoughtful he had always been, and she knew that from childhood up he had followed the command of Christ with a rare zeal, had loved masses and prayers in the Roman tongue, and ever sought the church as the place where he found his best solace. But all had felt that a full, gentle tide of courage and joy in life flowed through the quiet man's soul. Now it was as though something had ebbed away from him. She had not seen him drunken more than a single time since she came home. It was one evening of the wedding feast at Formoe. He had staggered somewhat then and been thick of speech, but he had not been out of the way merry. She remembered him as he had been in her childhood at the great ale-drinkings in festival seasons and at banquets, laughing his great laughter and slapping his thighs at each jest, offering to fight and wrestle with any man there who had a name for strength, trying horses, leaping about in the dance, and the first to laugh when his feet failed him, strewing around gifts and overflowing with goodwill and loving kindness toward all mankind. She understood that her father had need of these great outbursts of revelry, in the midst of his steadfast labours, his strenuous fastings, and his quiet home life with his own folks, who saw in him their best friend and surest stay. She felt, too, that if her husband never had this need to drink himself drunken, it was because he kept so little check on himself, even if he were never so sober, but ever followed his own devices without much thought over right and wrong, or what folk accounted seemly and wise behaviour. Erland was the most sober man as to strong drink that she had known. He drank to quench his thirst, and for the sake of good fellowship, without caring much about the matter. But now Lavrans Bjorgulfsson had lost his good heartiness over the ale-cup. No longer had he that within him which needed to be given vent in revelry. It had never come into his mind to drown his cares with hard drinking, and it came not now into his mind. To him it had always seemed that a man should take his joy to the drinking feast. With his sorrows he had gone elsewhere. There was a picture which always hung dim and half-remembered in his daughter's mind. Her father on that night when the church was burned. He stood beneath the crucifix that he had saved from the flames, bearing the cross and staying himself by it. Without clearly thinking it out, Kristin felt in her heart that it was in part fear for her and her children's future with the man she had chosen, and the feeling of his own helplessness in this matter that had changed Lavrans. This knowledge gnawed secretly at her heart, and as it was, she had come to Jorungard weary of the restless winter they had spent, and of her own weakness in making no stand against Erlend's heedlessness. She knew that he was and would ever be a spendthrift, that he had no wit in guarding goods and gear. They dwindled under his hands slowly but ceaselessly. One thing and another she had got him to set in order, as she and Sira Eilif had counselled. But she could not evermore be speaking to him of such things. And it was tempting too now to give herself up to gladness with him. She was so weary of striving and struggling with all the things, both without her and in her own soul. And yet was she such an one that careless pleasure too made her careworn and fearful. Here at home she had looked to find again the peace she had felt in her childhood, under her father's safekeeping. But no, she felt so unsafe. Erlend had good incomings from his wardenship, but he was living now with yet more pomp, and with a greater household and the following of a great chief. And he had begun to keep her quite outside all things in his life that touched not their most private life together. She understood that he would not have her heedful eyes watching his doings. With men he would talk willingly enough of all he had seen and gone through in the north, but to her he never named it. And there were other things. He had met Lady Ingeborg, the king's mother, and Sir Nut Pors more than once in these years. It had never so chanced at these times that she could be with him. Sir Nut was now a duke in Denmark, and King Hakon's daughter had bound her to him in wedlock. The marriage had waked bitter wrath in many Norsemen's minds, and steps, Kristin understood not what they were, had been taken against the lady. But the Bishop of Bjorgvin had sent certain chests to Huseby. They were now on board Margeigren, and the ship lay out at Ness. Erlend had been given letters and was to sail for Denmark later in the summer. He pressed her to go with him, but she set herself against it. She knew that Erlend moved among these great folks as their equal and dear kinsman, and she feared what might come of it. 'Twas unsafe with so rash a man as Erlend. But she could not pluck up heart to go with him. Never could she get him to hearken to counsel there, and she was loath to adventure herself in company with folks among whom she, a plain housewife, could scarce hold her own. And then there was the terror of the sea. Seasickness to her was a thing worse than the hardest childbed. Thus, as she went about in her old home, her heart was tremulous and ill at ease. One day she had gone with her father down to Skane, and she had seen again the precious rarity which the folk of that manor had in their keeping. 'Twas a spur of the purest gold, huge and in shape old-fashioned, with strange chasings. Like every child in the countryside, she knew where it had come from. 'Twas in the first times after St. Olaf had christened the dale that Aldhild the Fair of Skane was spirited away into the mountainside. They dragged the church bell up to the mountain and rang for the maid. And the third evening she came walking over the pastures, so decked out with gold that she shone like a star. Then the rope broke, the bell rolled down the scree, and Aldhild must turn back again into the hillside. But many years after there came one night 12 warriors to the priest. He was the first priest that ever was in Sill. They had golden helms and silver corslets, and they rode on dark brown stallions. 'Twas Aldhild's sons by the mountain king, and they prayed that their mother might be given burial as a Christian woman, and a grave in hallowed earth. She had striven to hold fast her faith and to keep the church's holy days in the mountain, and she had prayed so sorely for this grace. But the priest denied it to her. Folk said because of this he himself had found no rest in his grave, but on autumn nights he could be heard walking in the grove north of the church, weeping and bemoaning his harshness. The same night Aldhild's sons had appeared in Skane, bearing their mother's greeting to her old parents. And in the morning they found the golden spur in the courtyard. And 'twas clear that yonder folk still accounted the men of Skane as kin, for they had ever rare good fortune in the mountains. Lavrans said to his daughter as they rode homeward in the summer night, "These Aldhildsons said over the Christian prayers they had learnt of their mother. God's name and Jesu's name they could not name, but they said the Lord's Prayer and the Credo this way: I believe on yonder Almighty One. I believe on the only begotten Son. I believe on the most mighty Spirit." And then they said, "Hail thou, Lady, that art the blessed one among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, the comfort of all the world." Kristin looked timidly up in her father's lean, weather-beaten face. In the light summer night it looked so ravaged with sorrows and brooding as never before she had seen it. "You have never told me this before," she said in a low voice. "Had I not? Ah, no. I may have thought it might give you heavier thoughts than your years gave you strength to bear. Sigrid Undset says it is written in the books of St. Paul the Apostle, not man alone groaneth in travail." One day Kristin sat sewing on the topmost step of the stair to the upper hall, when Simon came riding into the courtyard and stopped just below her, but didn't see her. Her parents both came out to him. No, Simon would not alight. Ramborg had but bidden him ask, as he was passing by, the sheep that had been her pet lamb. They would scarce have sent it to the hills, and she would fain have it with her now. Kristin heard her father smite his hand to his head. "Ah, yes, Ramborg's sheep." He gave an angry laugh. An ill thing this. He had hoped she had forgotten it. For he had given his two eldest grandsons a little hatchet each, and the first thing they had used them for was to slaughter Ramborg's sheep. Simon laughed a little. "Aye, the Huseby boys, a rascal crew they are." Kristin ran down the stairway, loosing her silver scissors from its belt chain. "Give Ramborg this in amends for my son's killing her sheep. I know she has wanted it ever since she was small. None shall say that my sons—" She had spoken hotly, and now she fell suddenly silent. She had seen her father's and mother's faces. They looked on her gravely and wonderingly. Simon made no motion to take the scissors. He seemed somewhat abashed. Then he caught sight of Björgulf, and riding across to him leaned over and lifted the boy to the saddle-bow in front of him. "So, you are a Viking harrying our coasts. Well, now you are my prisoner, and tomorrow your parents can come over to me, and we will bargain about your ransom." Therewith he waved laughingly to the others and rode off, with the boy struggling and laughing in his arms. Simon had come to be right good friends with Erlend's sons. Kristin remembered that he had ever had a way with children. Her little sisters had loved him. It vexed her strangely that he should be so fond of children and have such a turn for playing with them, when her husband was ever so loath to hearken to children's talk. The day after, though, when they were at Formoe, she could well see that Simon's wife had given him small thanks for bringing this guest home with him. "No one could look that Ramborg should greatly care for children now," said Ranfrid. "She is scarce out of childhood yet herself. She will change, I warrant, as she grows older." "Doubtless she will." Simon and his mother-in-law exchanged a glance and the slightest of smiles. "Ah," thought Kristin, 'Twas nigh on 2 months from the wedding now. In the trouble and unease of mind that Kristin now suffered, she was apt to vent her disquiet on Erland. He took this sojourn on the manor of his wife's father contentedly and happily, like a man with conscience at ease. He was good friends with Ranfrid, and made no secret of his hearty love for his wife's father. Lavrans, too, seemed fond of his son-in-law, but so sore and watchful was Kristin now grown, that she felt that in Lavrans' kindness for Erland there was much of that pitying tenderness that Lavrans had always had for every living thing that seemed to him in some measure unfit to stand on its own feet. His love for his other daughter's husband was not of this kind. Simon could meet him as a friend and comrade. Simon and Erland too were good friends when they met, but they did not seek out each other's company. Kristin still felt a secret shrinking from Simon Dar, both by reason of what he knew of her, and still more because she knew that from that day at Oslo he had come off with honour and Erland with shame. She raged at the thought that even this Erland should be able to forget. Thus she was not ever good-humoured with her husband. And if Erland chanced to be in the mood to bear her testiness good-humouredly and with meekness, it vexed her that he took her words so little to heart. Another day it might chance that his temper was short, and then he would grow hot, and she would answer him coldly and bitterly. One evening they sat in the hearth-room house at Jorengard. Lavrans still felt most at home in this house, most of all in rainy weather, when the air was heavy, as today, for in the great hall the roof was flat and the smoke from the fireplace was a plague. But in the hearth-room the smoke rose up and hung under the roof-tree, even when they had to shut the vent-hole against the weather. Kristin sat by the hearth sewing. She was moody and dull. Over against her Margaret was half asleep over her seam, and yawned now and then. The children were romping noisily in the room. Ranfrid was at Formoe, and the most of the serving folk had gone out. Lavrans sat in his high seat, and Erland at the upper end of the outer bench. They had the chessboard between them, and moved the pieces in silence and after much pondering. Once, when Ivar and Skjul seemed set on pulling a puppy into 2 pieces between them, Lavrans rose and took the shrieking little beast from them. He said nothing, but sat down again to the game, holding the puppy in his lap. Kristin went over to them and stood with a hand on her husband's shoulder, watching the game. Erland had much less skill as a chess player than his father-in-law, and most often lost when they played in the evenings. But he took such things with careless good humour. This evening he played yet worse than was his wont. Kristin chid him for it once or twice, not too mildly and sweetly. Then Lavrans said at last, somewhat testily, "How should Erland keep his thoughts on the game while you stand there disturbing him? What would you here, Kristin? You have never had any skill of these games." "No. I think you folks believe I have no understanding of anything." "Of one thing I see you have no understanding," said her father sharply, "and that is how it beseems a wife to speak to her husband. Better were it you should go and keep your young ones in bounds. The din they make is worse than the wild hunt." Kristin went and set up her children in a row on the bench, and sat down beside them. "Be still now, my sons," she said. "Your grandfather likes not that you should romp and play in here." Lavrans looked at his daughter, but said no word. Soon after, the foster-mothers came in, and Kristin, the maids and Margaret went out with the children to put them to bed. Erland said, when he was alone with his father-in-law, "I could have wished, father-in-law, that you had not chidden Kristin as you did. If it comfort her to pick at me when she is in ill humour, why, it boots not to speak to her, and she will not suffer any to say a word about her children." "And you?" asked Lavrans. "Do you mean to suffer your sons to grow up so uncorrected? Where have the maids got to, that should keep the children by them and see to them?" "To your serving men's quarters, I imagine," said Erland, laughing and stretching himself. "But I dare not say a word to Kristin about her serving maids. She grows wroth in earnest then, and casts it in my teeth that she and I have scarce been a pattern for others." The day after, as Kristin went plucking strawberries along a meadow south of the manor, her father called to her from the smithy door and bade her come to him. Kristin went, somewhat against the grain. 'Twas Narkby again, likely. This morning he had left a gate open, and the home cattle had gotten into the barley field. Her father took a red-hot iron from the forge and laid it on the anvil. The daughter sat and waited, and for long there was no sound but the strokes of the hammer as they beat the sparking iron into a pothook, and the answering clang of the anvil. At last Kristin asked what he wanted. The iron was cold now. Lavrans put down the tongs and sledgehammer and came to her. With the soot on his face and hair, his clothes and hands black, and the great leathern apron in front of him, he looked sterner than was his wont. "I called you to me, my daughter, to say this to you. Here in my house you must show your wedded husband such reverence as beseems a wife. I will not hear my daughter speak to her master as you answered and spoke to Erland yesterday. 'Tis somewhat new, father, that you should think Erland a man to whom folks should show reverence." "He is your man," said Lavrans. "I didn't force you to wed him. Bear that in mind." "You two are such warm friends," answered Kristin. "Had you known him then as you know him now, doubtless you would have been fain to put force on me." Her father looked down at her gravely and sadly. "Now do you speak over hastily, Kristin, and say that which you know is untrue. I tried not to put force upon you, even when you were bent on throwing off your lawful betrothed husband, though you know that I loved Simon heartily." "No, but since Simon too would have none of me." "No. He was too high-minded to stand stiffly on his rights, seeing you were unwilling. But I know not if in his heart 'twould have gone so much against him had I done as Andras Dar would have had me, paid no heed to the wilfulness of you two young folks. And I could well nigh doubt whether Sir Andras was not right, now when I see that you cannot live happily with a husband you set all at naught to win." Kristin laughed aloud, an ugly laugh. "Simon! Never would you have forced Simon to take for wife the woman whom he had found with another man in such a house." Lavrans caught his breath. "What house?" he gasped out. "A house such as you men call a bordel. She that owned it, she had been Munan's paramour. She warned me herself that I should not go there. I said I went to meet my kinsman. I knew not that he was her kinsman." She laughed again, a wild, cruel laugh. "Be silent," said the father. He stood still a moment. A shiver passed over his face, a smile that seemed to blanch it. There came to her the thought of a wooded hillside, how it whitens when a storm gust turns over all its leaves in a wave of palely glittering light. He learns much that questions not. Kristin huddled down where she sat on the bench, leaning on one elbow and hiding her eyes with the other hand. For the first time in her life she was in fear of her father, in deadly fear. He turned away from her, went and took up the sledgehammer and put it in its place amongst the other hammers. Then he gathered together files and other small tools and set himself to placing them in order on the crossbeam between the walls. He stood with his back to her. His hands shook violently. "Have you never thought, Kristin, that Erland kept silent about that?" He stood before her, looking down into her white, frightened face. "I gave him no for an answer, curtly enough, when he came to me at Tunsberg with his rich kinsman, and made suit for you. I didn't know then that I should have been but too thankful that he was willing to restore my daughter's honour, Many men would have let me know it then. He came again and made suit for you in full honour. Not all men would have been so steadfast in striving to win to wife one who was already what you then were. That I think no man had dared to tell you. 'Tis not of cold steel that Erland has ever been afraid. Lavrans' face had grown unspeakably weary. His voice had gone hollow and dead. But soon he spoke again, quietly and firmly. As bad as all this has been, Kristin, I think 'tis worst of all that you should tell it, now he is your husband and the father of your sons. If it be, as you say, you knew the worst of him before you braved everything that you might wed him. And he was willing to buy you at as great a price as though you had been an honest maid. Much freedom to rule your life and manage your affairs has he given you. Therefore should you make amends for your sin by managing with understanding and making up for what Erland lacks in prudence. You owe this much to God and your children. I have said myself, and others have said the same, that Erland seems not to be fit for anything else than to beguile women. You are answerable in part for such things being said. To that you have now yourself borne witness. Since then he has shown that after all he was fit for something else. Your husband has won himself a good name for a bold and swift leader in war. 'Tis no small gain for your sons that their father has won fame for boldness and skill in arms. That he was unwise, you should have known best of all of us. It would be best that you make amends for your shame by honouring and helping the husband you yourself have chosen. Kristin had bent forward over her lap, her head in her hands. Now she looked up wildly and despairingly. Cruel, cruel was it of me to tell you this. Oh, Simon begged me. 'Twas the only thing he begged of me, that I should spare you the knowledge of the worst. Simon bade you spare me? She heard the suffering in his voice, and she knew this too was cruel of her to tell him that a stranger had seen she needed to be bidden spare her father. Then Lavrans sat down by her, took one of her hands between both of his and laid them on his knee. Cruel it was, my Kristin, he said gently and sadly. Kind are you to all, my child, my treasure, but I have seen this before too. You can be cruel to them you love too dear. For Jesu's sake, Kristin, spare me from the need of going in such fear for you. Fear that this wild heart of yours will yet bring more sorrow over you and yours. You tug and strain like a young horse when it is first tied up to the stake, wherever you are tied by your heartstrings. Sobbing, she sank against him, and her father drew her into his arms and held her close and firmly. Thus they sat a long while, but Lavrans said no more. At last he lifted up her head. Now you are all black, he said with a little smile. There is a cloth in yonder corner, but it will probably make you blacker. You must go home and make you clean again. Anyone can see you have been sitting in the smith's lap. He pushed her gently out of the door, closed it behind her and stood still a space. Then he staggered the few steps across to the bench, sank down on it, and sat with his head thrown back against the log wall and with an upturned, distorted face. With all his force he pressed one hand against his heart. It was well that it never lasted long. The breathlessness, the black dizziness, the pain shooting out through the limbs from the heart that struggled and shook, gave one or two heavy thuds, and then stood quivering still again, the blood hammering in the neck veins. It would pass in a little while, It always passed when he sat still a little, but it came again, more and more often. Erland had agreed with his ship's crew to meet at Vioi on the eve of St. James' Mass, but he tarried at Yorengard a little longer to go with Simon and hunt down a big bear that had been harrying the satyr cattle. When he came home from the hunt, he found word awaiting him that his men had fought with the townsmen, and he must hasten thither to bail them out. Lavrans had an errand in those parts, so he rode along with his son-in-law. It was near to the end of Olaf's Mass feast when they came out to the island. Erling Vidkunsen's ship lay there, and at evensong in Peter's church they met the high steward. He came with them to the monastery where Lavrans had taken lodging, ate supper with them there, and sent his men down to the ship to fetch some rarely good French wine he had gotten at Nidaros. But the talk went but haltingly over the wine. Erland sat wrapped in his own thoughts, his eyes bright and eager as ever when a new venture was before him, but unheedful of the other's speech. Lavrans but sipped the wine, and Sir Erling was quiet and said little. "You look weary, kinsman." "Aye, they had had heavy weather crossing Husestadviken the night before. He had been up, and you must ride hard if you would be at Tunsberg by Lawrence Mass Day. And much rest or solace will you scarce find there either." "Is Master Parl with the king now?" said Erland. "Aye. Do you stop at Tunsberg on your way?" "To ask if the king would have me bear his loving and duteous greetings to his mother," Erland laughed. "Or if Bishop Olfin would send word by me to the lady." "Many do wonder that you should be journeying to Denmark, now that the chief men of the kingdom are gathering to the meeting at Tunsberg," said Sir Erling. "Isn't it strange that folk must ever be wondering at me?" said Erland. "Surely 'tis no marvel if I have a mind to see a little of such manners and breedings as I have not seen since I was last in Denmark, to ride in a tourney once again, and since our kinswoman has bidden us to come. You know well that none other of her kindred in this land will avow her now, save only Munin and I." Munin. Erling frowned and then laughed. "Is there so much life left in the old boar that he can still move his brawn about?" "So Duke Knut is to hold a tourney. Doubtless then Munin is to ride in the jousting?" "Aye, it's a pity of you, Erland, that you cannot bear us company and see that sight." Erling too laughed. "I mark well that you fear Lady Ingeborg has bidden us to this christening ale, so that we may brew the ale for another feast and bid her to it. No, you should know best that I am too heavy-handed and too light at heart to be of much use in hatching plots. And you have drawn every tooth in Munin's head," Erland said. "Oh no, we are not so fearful either of plots from that quarter. Methinks it must be clear as day to Ingeborg Harkensdatter now that she made forfeit of all her rights in her own land when she wedded with the Porse. 'Twill be a hard matter for her to get a foot inside our doors, now she has laid her hand in that man's, whose least finger we will never suffer in our affairs." "Aye, 'twas wisely done of you indeed to part the boy from his mother," said Erland darkly. "He is but a child yet, and already have we Norsemen cause to hold our heads high when we think of the king we have sworn fealty to." "Be still," said Erling Vidkunsen, low and vehemently. "For sure it is untrue." Erland said, "'Tis whispered in every manor and every cabin in our north country that Christ's church burned because our king is unworthy to sit in St. Olaf's seat." "In God's name, Erland, I say 'tis unsure whether it's true. And if it were, a child like King Magnus, we must sure believe is without sin in God's eyes. He can redeem himself. Do you say that we have parted him from his mother? I say God punish that mother who betrays her son, as Ingeborg betrayed hers. And put not your trust in such a one, Erland. Bear in mind that they are faithless folk you journey now to meet. Methinks you have kept faith with each other fairly enough. But as for you, you talk as if letters from heaven dropped every day into your lap. 'Tis that, maybe, makes you so bold to fight with the lords of the church. No, let us have an end of this, Erland. Talk of things you have wit to understand, boy, and else be silent. Sir Erling had risen, and he and Erland stood face to face, red with anger. Take heed of your tongue, Erland, he went on in a little. Think twice before you speak where you are going, and think again 20 times before you do anything. If that is what you do, you who rule the roost here, then I'm not surprised that things here move so slowly. But you need not be afraid, he yawned. I shall do nothing, I think. But 'tis grown a rare land to live in now, this one of ours. Are you setting forth early tomorrow? My father-in-law is weary. The two others sat on in silence after he had bidden them good night. Erland was sleeping aboard his ship. Erling Vidkundsen sat turning his goblet between his fingers. You are coughing, he said, that he might say something. Old men grow full of rheum so easily. We have many plagues, you see, my lord, that you young folk know nothing of, said Lavrans, smiling. Again they were silent, till Erling Vidkundsen said, as though half to himself, Aye, so do all men think, that this land is ill-guided. 6 years ago at Oslo I thought I had seen clearly that there was a firm intent to uphold the kingly power among the men of the houses to whom that duty falls by birth. I built upon that. I believe you saw rightly, my lord. But you said yourself, we are used to rally round our king, and now our king is a child, and half the time in a foreign land. There are times when I think nothing is so bad, but it is in some ways good. In the old times, when our kings bore them like wild stallions, there was a store of brave foals to rear. Our folk needed but to choose the one that was the best fighter. Lavrans laughed a little. Yes. Then Erling said, We talked together 3 years ago, Lavrans Lagmanson, when you came back from pilgrimage to Skovda and had seen your kinsfolk in Gautland. I remember, my lord. You did me the honour to seek me out. Nay, Lavrans, no need for so much courtesy. He struck out a little impatiently with his hand. 'Tis even as I said then, he went on gloomily. No one now can bring together the nobles of this land. They push to the front that are most fain to fill their bellies, when there is some meat left in the trough. But they that might aspire to win might and riches by such service as was held in honour in our fathers' day, they don't come forth. So it would seem. True it is that honour follows the banner of the chief. Then men must think, I imagine, that with my banner there follows little honour, said Erling dryly. You too have held aloof from all that might have made you a name, Lavrans Lagmanson. So have I done ever since I have been a wedded man, my lord. I was wedded early. My wife was sickly, her health could not bear much going about in company, and it seems as if our stock doth not thrive here in Norway. My sons died early, and only one of my brother's sons lived to a man's age. They sat again in silence a while. Such men as Erland, said the High Steward low. They are the most dangerous. They that have thoughts that go a little farther than their own concerns, but not far enough. Is he not like an idle child, this Erland? He shoved his wine cup around about on the table in his vexation. He is no dullard. He has birth and valour. But he never troubles himself to hear so much of any matter as to understand it through and through. And should he ever care to hear a man out, he had forgot the beginning, like enough, before he got to the end. Lavrans looked across at the other. Sir Erling had aged much since last he had seen him. He looked worn and weary, seemed not to fill his seat so fully as before. He had fine, clear-cut features, but they were a little too small, and his colour was, as it were, a little faded. Had been so always, Lavrans felt that this man, though he was an upright, knightly man, prudent and willing to serve faithfully and unflinchingly, yet, however measured, was somewhat too small to be the first man in the realm. Had he been a head taller, was likely he would more easily have found full following. Lavrans said low, Sir Newt, too, to be sure, is wise enough to see this, if they are hatching anything down there, that in any secret councils he would find Erland of small use. You like this son-in-law of yours in a fashion, Lavrans, said the other almost testily, though, truth to tell, you don't have any real cause to love him. Lavrans sat drawing with his finger on the table in some spilled wine. Sir Erling marked how loosely the rings sat on his fingers now. Have you cause? Lavrans looked up with his faint smile. And yet I think that you like him too. Aye, God knows. But you can swear on it now, Lavrans. Many things are running in Sir Newt's head now. He is father of a son that is King Hakon's grandson. Aye, but even Erland must sure understand that Charles' father has all too broad a back for the little lordling ever to be able to get around it. And the mother has our whole country against her because of this marriage. A little while after, Erling Vidkundsen stood up and buckled on his sword. Lavrans had courteously taken his guest's cloak from the hook where it hung, and stood with it in his hands. Then of a sudden he swayed, and would have fallen to the ground had not Sir Erling caught him in his arms. With much pains and labour he managed to bear the other, a big tall man, over to the bed. A stroke it was not, but Lavrans lay there, his lips blue and white, with slack, strengthless limbs. Sir Erling ran across the yard and waked up the hospice father. Lavrans seemed much abashed when he came to himself. Aye, it was a weakness that took hold on him now and then. 'Twas from an elk hunt he had been on 2 winters back. He lost his way in a snowstorm. Perhaps something like this was ever needed to teach a man his youth is gone from him. He smiled in excuse. Sir Erling tarried till the monk had bled the sick man, though Lavrans prayed him not to trouble himself, seeing that he was to set forth at daybreak. The moon shone bright, riding high above the hills of the mainland, and the water lay black in their shadow, but out on the fjord the light floated in flakes of silver. No smoke from any vent hole. The grass on the house roofs glittered with dew in the moonlight. Not a human soul in the one short street of the little town, as Sir Erling walked swiftly the short space, but a few steps, to the king's mansion where he slept. He looked strangely slim and small in the moonlight, with the black cloak gathered closely about him, shivering a little. A pair of sleepy serving men who had sat up for him came tumbling out into the courtyard with a lantern. The high steward took the lantern and sent the men to bed. He shivered a little again as he climbed the staircase to the storehouse loft, where he was to sleep.